Hello, welcome everyone to this next edition of our Office Shock LinkedIn Live series. My name is John Clemay. I'm with the Institute for the Future, and I'm very, very pleased today to be introducing our two guests, Joseph Press and Christine Bullen. They're two of the co-authors of the book Office Shock, which you see there on the slide. It just came out. I just got my copy in hand for the first time 2 days ago and could not be more excited. So I wanted to just to give a little table setting for what's happening today. What you see on the screen now is the Office Shock Quick Start Guide, which Joseph and Christine will walk you through. It's actually located within the book, so it's a nice little tear out that you can have. And if you could forward to the next slide, this is what you would see on LinkedIn. This is the second session in a series of LinkedIn Live sessions, which we will be talking to different folks in the industry and learning a little bit more about Office Shock and how you can use it for yourself, for your industry, for your organization, and so forth. So with that, I'll pass the mic back to our lovely hosts, Joseph and Christine. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you, John. It's welcome, everyone. It's great to be here. And we're hoping to make this as interactive as we can. So we could start by having everyone go into the chat setting and tell us where you're located in joining our meeting today. And that would be a nice way to start. As John said, we're going to be discussing the Quick Start Guide. And I'm here with one of my co-authors, Joseph. And Joseph is a former workplace architect and designer, but now he's focusing on transformation and futures architecture, which is very exciting. And as John said, the Quick Start Guide is included in our book. It's a great color tear out. We're actually delighted that our publisher, Barrett Kohler, was able to do that for us. But for people who get the audiobook or the ebook, you can go onto our website at officeshock.org and download all of the graphics, and including the Quick Start Guide to make it easy. So as I said, we're encouraging questions, and we'd love to hear from you. Let me just preface what Joseph is going to say by explaining that the purpose of the Quick Start Guide is to provide a guide that summarizes the key concepts in the book and helps you navigate throughout the book. So with that, I will turn over to Joseph and say, please introduce us to the Quick Start Guide.
Thank you, Christine, and wonderful to have the chance to share our Quick Start Guide, which, as we were writing the book, I think you probably brought this up at some point in time. It was important for us to begin thinking about how can we help our readers apply our approach to navigate Office Shock towards better futures for working and living. And the idea of the Quick Start Guide really emerged as a way for us to very clearly outline our three-step methodology, that future back methodology that Bob Johansen, our other co-author, and myself spoke about on Tuesday, our first LinkedIn Live Office Shock talk. So the idea of a Quick Start Guide is a way to summarize what we anticipate readers will want to do as they begin to think about what future, what next, what now. So those three steps, future back, thinking about what future, then thinking about what next, and then thinking about what now. Those three steps are the three parts of the book. Part one, what future, part two, what next, and part three, what now. And we introduced the Quick Start Guide at the beginning of part three, the what now, with the intention of bringing together those three steps. So if we could quickly show the Quick Start Guide, There are a couple of really important illustrations in that guide. So we begin with the most important question: what is the future self that you are facing office shock with? And we identified 3 selves, if you will: ourselves as individuals, ourselves as members of an organization, and ourselves as citizens or members of a community. And those 3 lenses will have a very important influence on what future, what next, what now. So, for example, if we were to look at office shock from the point of view of an individual, we would probably look at it from ourselves in our current roles, our careers, our aspirations. Where might we like to get to in 10 years? Imagining we are able to get through office shock, imagining that we have come to grips with the challenges of home office versus working in the office building, that we have been able to navigate the challenges of the next pandemic, that we have also come to terms with who we are and our social identities, and who do we want to work with, who would we like to work with, who might we need to work with that might be different. Once we have an understanding of what are those individual preferences, then we can begin to address, well, what future might I want for more purpose, for more belonging, for more prosperity, across all those spectrums of choice that we refer to in our mixing board. And with that intention, you go into those futures to identify what next by those spectrums and making those kinds of choices, which would then help to identify, well, what now? What would be some of the actions that we would like to take now? So that, Chris, a bit abstract, and we can get into some more details, but the intention of being able to help our readers structure thinking, acting, and deciding to be able to face office shock on that journey to a more preferred and ideally plausible future.
Yeah, I think some people might be a little afraid of the concept of finding their future self, but it is important in using the ideas, the concepts, and the tools that we have in the book that you differentiate between what you might be concerned about as an individual and from what you might be concerned about as not only a member of an organization, but a leader of an organization. Because there you're talking more about the future of where you want your organization to go. And of course, the community persona is one of the interesting ones because you can be talking about a local community or a worldwide community. The idea of that one is there are policymakers at all of those levels who will have very important influences on where we are going in the future.
Indeed, and that point on the community, I think, is very important, as we are seeing many, many signals that there will be more and more interest in creating communities, local communities, as you said, and a great signal of that is the rise of agricultural cooperatives in your place, New York City. Some of the largest open roof gardens, particularly in Brooklyn, are emerging as a significant way to be able to not only produce fruits and vegetables, but also to bring people together in a community that is really focused on more collective purpose, trying to create collective prosperity, creating more a sense of belonging. So if you imagine being on those rooftops, overlooking gardens, and then in the background seeing Manhattan, there's a very interesting message that's strengthening the community. Well, we are trying to create something that is a bit more cohesive, that there is more sharing, that there is much more of a connection between people than, obviously this is a bit superficial, than you may find in the center of Manhattan.
Well, and add to that this new, well, relatively new movement of taking buildings that have been primarily commercial and turning them into residential commercial combinations, which I think is very exciting because people can actually live in the building they also work in. It's kind of the old fashioned, I have my shop on the ground floor, but my family is upstairs.
Indeed, and that also was historically the way primarily European cities were designed, was that there was much more of a mix. And obviously because of the size of the US, the landscape, and also the culture, we actually see in Europe cities like Rotterdam that are also going through a regenerative process where they are using agriculture, greening. They're also changing mobility and transportation within the cities, where there are bike paths, where there is more shared vehicles. We see a lot of signals of this community-based future. And to your earlier point, that was why we felt that it was important for us to give the opportunity for our readers to be able to reflect on what kind of a community would they like in making those choices of what now. What we also found to be very important when looking at the future self from the organizational role was that, yes, many organizations will have a stated purpose. One of the probably classic examples of more purpose in an organization is Unilever. And we refer to the Unilever case study in our book. And what we have seen is that there is much more sense of belonging, a much more sense of that shared purpose when a large organization like Unilever brings that kind of shared identity of a collective within a company to be able to give that harmony and sense of satisfaction, more purpose, if you will, for members of that organization.
Well, and what we were also finding when we were doing this research is that this is very, very important to the younger generation, to the new workforce. And they're looking for companies that have a sense of purpose that they can identify with and help them with their own sense of purpose. So that the organizational piece is extraordinarily important.
Indeed. And actually, I'd be very curious, Chris, we had talked about potentially, since this is a smaller group in today's talk, could we just see how many of you are looking at Office Shock? Yeah, the question of how might we, or how might I take the opportunity when being asked, should I be in the office 2 days a week or 3 days a week? Should I be in my home office 2 days a week or 3 days a week? How many of you are thinking about answering that question from the point of view of yourself, your own aspirations, your own purpose, your own sense of prosperity, versus how many of you are looking at it from being inside an organization? And as we just talked about, curious to see if any of you are also looking at it from the point of view of your membership or your citizenship in a community. And that community can be quite small, as we just mentioned, the community of cooperative rooftop gardens in Brooklyn, or it could be a religious community, or it could be a city.
Well, people, I hope, are giving us some comments on that. There's a somewhat amusing, since I live in New York, comment from Katerina, that she would be hesitant to consume produce grown in a metropolitan area such as Brooklyn due to the potential effects of pollution on the vegetation. But I guess the flip side of that is the more vegetation we have on rooftops, the better the air is getting. So I think those actually can benefit each other.
Indeed, and what's interesting about that comment and concern is that, again, we're seeing more signals of cities making choices that integrate nature. So I spent a lot of time in Milan, where I teach, and a very interesting example of that integration is the Bosco Verticale. So we can share a picture of that building housing that was actually designed in a way that integrates trees and other natural settings. And so certainly, if I put my hat on as an architect, seeing how that transition is beginning to influence the design of buildings. So it's happening at a city scale in the example, as we said, Rotterdam, as one example, the example in Brooklyn, where we're seeing more rooftop gardens and communities around that. And then in the center of Milan, where high rises are being built. And those two buildings, particularly the Bosco Verticale, which is the vertical forest in English, those are actually built around an area where there is extensive gardens, extensive walking areas, extensive bike paths and scooter paths as well. So I think the idea of breaking down those boundaries, which we used to see, particularly in the built environment in cities, between the natural world and the built world, those are beginning to break down. And with that intention, what we also anticipate is that in a post-COVID world, the boundaries between your individual persona and your organizational persona have broken down. The best example of that is what we're doing right now. And when I see, Chris, your photos and illustrations on the wall, you see my background. How many of us have been on a Zoom call and the kids have come in? That is a fundamental breaking down of those barriers, those boundaries between our individual personas, our organizational personas, and even our community personas.
Absolutely. We have a comment. Well, we have several comments, but there's a comment from Ian about the fact that he is focused right now on interacting with his colleagues at work. And I think an interesting question there is whether or not he's talking about in person or interacting using technology as we're doing right now, because obviously we're in a point in time where people are doing a lot of both.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's, I think, a good opportunity for us to, if we can go to the next slide, and we can take a look at, once we have clarity on where are we, yeah, so these are those future selves, that individual, the organizational, and the community. And if we go to the next slide, we can then begin to think about, well, what future do we want? And when we think about the question of what's typically referred to as hybrid working, we've introduced in the book the office verse, and the office verse as a archipelago, a landscape, a menu of places to work, all of which have advantages and disadvantages. And so the idea of thinking about a future where we can all work in the office verse, i.e., we can make choices about where should we work in order to achieve certain objectives. So in Ian's context, it may be that there is a need for a face-to-face interaction because of serendipitous conversations, or the need for co-creation of a strategy, co-creation of a new product or service, or even co-creation of something as simple as a budget. And the ability to co-create can happen anywhere in the office first, but the real question is, what is the level of connectivity, the trust between people when thinking about those selves? And so that's when you can begin to ask that question. Well, what is the future? What do we need to accomplish? And then be able to answer the next question. Well, then we should make some choices about where we should be working. Now, ideally, the question of where are we working is also going to be informed by our other questions that are part of the mixing board, those 7 spectrums of choice. Why are we working? What are the expected outcomes? What are the climate impacts that we anticipate? How can we actually use this future to create more belonging? How might we use technology to augment our decision making or our creative capabilities in the case of ChatGPT or the AI art generators? And then also to make some choices about, well, how might we be flexible in the way that we're teaming? So that would be an example of having that question, am I in the office 2 or 3 days a week? Putting it into the context of, well, what future, what do we need to accomplish? And then understanding, well, what would be some of the expected outcomes to then make a choice. All right, well, then what do we do now?
Yes, and actually, Ian clarified in another comment that his work is involving a lot of working from home. And because they're an international company, and Kristen also commented that because she's working for a very global organization, they're doing a large percentage of working from home, which she finds preferable. And I think it's very interesting that because we were all forced into lockdown, well, many office workers were forced into lockdown because of the COVID pandemic, they actually discovered that working from home has advantages. Granted, there are disadvantages. It wasn't all a rosy picture, but for people who could do it and had the space and the ability to not be overrun by their families while they were working at home, they actually found they could be more productive. They weren't wasting time the way they often did, not only in commuting to offices, but in being in offices. So I think, you know, we've said over and over again that where you're working and when you're working isn't the first question we want you to think about. It's number 6 in our 7 spectrums. But for most people, it's still very top of mind, and we have to recognize that it's an important decision for them.
Yeah, and as we said, it's an important opportunity to try to expand the conversation. Now, that is really dependent on organizational culture, organizational leadership. It's also dependent on community culture. So just this afternoon, I had lunch with a friend who is the EVP of Human Resources at a global manufacturing company. And the CEO had just announced that he's expecting everyone to come back to the office. And what my friend said to me was, well, that might be, you know, that individual's intention. Okay. And here's a good example of the individual CEO. I'm saying that everybody needs to go back to the office. However, what my friend said was that in our culture, particularly our organizational culture, that is not just a top-down decision. And it was interesting because he said our company culture is not, and I'll say this as an American, not an American-like culture where it can be more top-down. And it was fascinating just to see those cultural stories as a way to explain whether this pronouncement could be implemented or not, or how might it be implemented. And that was where I was fortunate. I had a copy of the book and just happened to bring it.
We carry it with us everywhere.
just happened to have a copy in my bag over lunch. And what I did was to open up the mixing board to be able to show, as you said, Chris, those other 6 questions. And what was fascinating, his initial reaction was, wow, they are all connected. So even though top of mind, the when and where we work, our spectrum number 6, time and place, even though that's top of mind, when he saw the mixing board, and particularly the harmony, okay, that we imply in the illustration in the mixing board, his initial response was, I need to get the CEO involved in this. I need to get the CIO involved with this, because there's clearly a technology play. It's not just the CEO's focus on probably between purpose and profit. That's why I'm not mentioning the name of this company. But they've got SBU units. Every one is a single P&L. So that CEO pronouncement probably coming from the perspective of being able to drive more profit. Okay? And that might be the opportunity to say, well, wait, do we need to have a conversation about having more prosperity? Finding the balance between his focus on shareholder capitalism and looking more at stakeholder capitalism, particularly when we spoke about the importance of community. So, and he kind of went down the list, and then clearly the CHRO to be involved because of the topic of belonging. And in the business units, also very important, particularly about agility. So the agility spectrum, is it a stable structure, i.e. an org chart? And in global organizations, those org charts can get pretty complicated. I think many of us have seen some of the software to map org charts and to try to track all the changes in org charts versus something that is, as our co-author Bob Johansen refers to, a shape-shifting organization. And when business units begin to think about any kind of business initiative, whether it be a new technology, it may be a new policy, maybe a new market, all of those business initiatives, those projects, if you will, should have some consideration for more flexible teaming.
Yeah, earlier when you were giving examples, you referred to creating a budget as a simple task, and I chuckled.
Why?
I think you've just explained why that's not a simple task anymore, if it ever was.
Indeed. And I think that just on that point, it's another good reminder. In the last, I'd say 15 years, but certainly the last 10 years, because of the rise of digital technologies, we typically, in our post-COVID world, just relish in how we are all adapted using digital technologies, whether it be Teams or Zoom or StreamYard in our case, using Google Drive, for example. That has all of a sudden become table stakes. You've got to be able to collaborate and work in those platforms. And your point about the Excel file, in Google Sheets, you can actually you can simultaneously work together on a document. All of that has raised the level of participation. And I think that's a really important point. Yes, the younger generation is expecting to participate in collaborating on whatever activity is happening. More importantly, I think, is that they will have to have that voice. They will expect to have it. And if they don't have it, then there is a high likelihood of disenfranchised. And I think that's a big risk. We talk about the great opportunity that has happened because of all the shocks in the past and just in the last couple of years. Starting from pandemic, but including Black Lives Matter, including Me Too, including Russia-Ukraine war, energy crisis, particularly here in Europe. All of those shocks, keeping in mind that more and more individuals are expecting to have a voice. With the rise of social media, with the rise of collaborative technologies, which, Chris, you've been tracking and researching and writing about for a number of years. How have you seen that actually influence mindset and behavior? Because that, I believe, is fundamental when thinking about, well, how might you navigate office shock towards better future? How might you engage everyone in this collective conversation?
Well, and that actually fits with another question we got from Linda, which is what we're talking about here is very dependent on the technology working when we need it to work. And that clearly isn't always the case, as we found this morning when we were getting ready to do this. I neglected to mention, by the way, Joseph was saying here in Europe, Joseph is joining us from Zurich, where he lives, even though he's American. So we have a very global group here at the moment. Definitely, one of the things, we did a podcast a week or so ago with someone who is focused on what he calls the tech whisperers. And that's an area in my career as an information technology professor that I was very, very closely related to. And I think one of the mistakes that many companies make is they don't realize the leadership role that whoever is in charge of their technology is currently playing and will increasingly play as we get into more technologies supporting our office work. Now, obviously, some organizations call that the Chief Information Officer, CIO, but not all do, and not all give the leadership position to people who are doing that. But it's becoming absolutely critical. I mean, we like to say that technology was ready for us to be working from home. Zoom was not something that happened overnight. People had been working on this technology for decades. And we're becoming so much more reliant on it. And we have to understand that a lot of effort and planning has to go into that. And there's going to be an enormous change in the capabilities of the technology in the next 10 years, which is why we have one of our spectrums focused on augmentation. How are we as humans going to make use of technology to be better at what we do? Bob jokingly, well, no, not jokingly, Bob refers to the fact that in the future we're all going to be cyborgs. I think that scares a few people. But what he means is, we're going to be using that technology in many ways. And we have to be ready for that and be ready to learn and accept the value of being able to augment our human capabilities with computer ones.
Yeah. And, building on that, the idea of being ready for whatever future, whether it be we all become cyborgs, we all go into let's refer to it as a virtual reality environment as our preferred place of working and living and interacting, or we are ideally able to come out of the climate crises with more sustainable and then ideally regenerative practices, circular economy as one example. A significant shift away from fossil fuels to renewables in an equitable way. So it's not just extractive. Let's say that we're able to envision those futures. Let's say that we are able to make some of the hard choices as that what next. For example, policy changes that will require ESG reporting. That is certainly what's next. Why is it what's next? Well, because we know that we need a future that is going to be more just, more equitable, more sustainable. And those then come eventually, sooner than later, to the question, so what do we do now? And the intention here is by addressing the what do we do now, I like what you said, Chris, that we need to be ready. The technology is there. Let's say that the solutions are there, solutions for more sustainable practices, for example. Well, what we propose in that what now is actually scaffolding the changes. And that little diagram in the bottom is all about looking at change in 3 dimensions. And that 3 dimensions are, well, what do we want to accomplish? That's the solutions that we want to have, that we believe are important in order to prepare for that preferred future. The second dimension is, well, how are we actually going to create those? And that is really rooted in, certainly my background in design of co-creation. That example that I mentioned earlier about some of the city design changes that are happening in Rotterdam, well, they actually spent quite an effort actually getting citizens' input. How would they imagine the city looking? And not surprisingly, there was a lot of input on the importance of having greener areas, more trees, having more sustainable mobility with more bike paths. So this kind of the how question, I think, is fundamental in thinking about how might we scaffold the changes that have to happen in order for us to arrive at that preferred future. And then that last one you had mentioned, Chris, the point on leadership. Leadership is all about how do you mobilize people for collective action? And yes, there is the mindset to have a more of a growth mindset, which is an important topic. To be more empathetic, to think full spectrum, referring to Bob's previous book and a bit of the conversation that we had on Tuesday. So all the mindset is there, but what we see is the importance of synchronizing actions. So those choices, for example, the CEO wanting everyone to come back, the organizational culture, well, we need to have a conversation about that. And my friend, the EVP of HR, he was excited because in a couple of weeks, they are going to be having leadership sessions where leaders will be bringing their teams into open conversations about some of these topics, and to be able to have the space physically, because everyone will be coming together, but more importantly, having a safe place to be able to have those conversations and to be able to hash out what are the differences, to be able to get alignment on the choices. That's a really powerful way to begin mobilizing for collective action. That's really what leadership is all about. And I'll wrap that up just by emphasizing the importance of, again, what Bob, our co-author, always says, having clarity of direction, but flexibility of how to arrive there. And that's why we like this idea of a 3-dimensional scaffold. We refer to this notion of flexive intent, having an intention to create an organization that is going to have more belonging, that will have more shared purpose, that will use technologies in ways that will augment better decision making, more transparency. That future is an important intention, but knowing that there will be issues. For example, technology is not going to work all the time. There may be some, see what happened yesterday in the UK, the cyber attack in the Royal Mail, which has stopped mail. So those shocks, those surprises, what we referred to as mules, will always be coming. Pandemic is a good example. Russia-Ukraine war, another good example. Black Lives Matter, Me Too. These shocks are going to continue, particularly in a decade, which the Institute for the Future refers to as a decisive decade. There's going to be a lot of shocks happening, and having clarity about where we want to go, but flexibility on how we arrive there, and scaffolding the choices, bringing people on board in a thoughtful way is going to be very, very important as we navigate office shock towards better futures for working and living.
Very, very nice summary. Thank you, Joseph. I think at this point, we are ready to wrap up.
Mhm.
And I just want to mention that a recording of this session will be available on LinkedIn, and it's also going to be posted on YouTube. Correct?
Indeed.
Yes.
And if we go to the next slide, there's a couple more announcements as well. So here we are reminding everyone, Office Shock is available now. It will be launched globally next Tuesday. We have our full author team LinkedIn Live launch session on the 17th of January. Excited that that will be facilitated by Marielle Ibiami. This is just a quick QR code. If you'd like to order the book, the discount code is there, off Shock. For both purchases, our publisher, Barrett Kohler, is offering to connect with Leslie Crandall. Encourage anyone that would like to join the Office Shock conversation to reach out to John Clemay, who opened up today's session. And there are many other events on our webpage. Check out iftf.org, events that are related to Office Shock, but also go into a lot more depth. For example, equitable enterprises. That's a very important research initiative that the Institute for the Future has been following, developing, and we do capture some of that in our chapter 6 on prosperity and greater outcomes. But there's a lot more content there as well, in addition to our Foresight Essentials program, which has other experts speaking on these topics and strategic foresight and futures thinking in general.
I just want to add to this slide that people have been asking about an audiobook, and we do have an audiobook, but that's only available on Amazon. So if you search for Office Shock on Amazon, you can order it there.
Indeed. Wonderful.
Well,
Chris, I want to thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you on Tuesday for our LinkedIn Live launch session.
Yes, we're all very excited about that. And I want to thank you all for joining us. As usual, this has been a good interaction and good questions. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and see you next Tuesday.